Blood trickled down Evelyn's dark fingers as white military police surrounded her van. "Step away from the vehicle, ma'am," they ordered, hands hovering over holsters. Then the crowd parted. A four-star general spotted the faded mark on her forearm, immediately snapped to attention, and saluted her. Before we dive into this incredible story of honor, discrimination, and long overdue recognition, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to join our storytelling community. What would you do if you witnessed someone being mistreated based on their appearance, only to discover they were actually a hero? Let's find out what happens next in this powerful true story. The July sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Benning, Georgia, as 62-year-old Evelyn Jackson wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of grease across her dark skin. Her weathered fingers worked methodically on the engine of her ancient military-modified van, a relic from another era just like herself. This wasn't how she had planned to spend the afternoon of her annual pilgrimage to visit the graves of fallen comrades. Every year for the past 30 years, Evelyn made this journey alone, driving from her small home in South Carolina to military cemeteries across the country, honoring promises made decades ago in jungles and war rooms where black soldiers like herself fought not just America's enemies but the prejudice within their own ranks. The van had never failed her before, but today of all days, the engine sputtered and died just outside the main entrance to Fort Benning. She could feel eyes on her as she worked, suspicious glances from white passers-by who saw only an elderly black woman in worn clothes bent over an engine. Evelyn ignored them as she had ignored such looks all her life, focusing instead on the mechanical problem at hand. Her fingers, once nimble enough to disassemble and reassemble an M16 blindfolded, now battled arthritis as she tightened a loose connection in the engine block. The sound of boots on pavement made her pause, but she didn't look up immediately. Years of situational awareness honed in combat zones told her 3 people approached, walking with the distinctive cadence of military personnel. "Ma'am, you can't park here," came a young voice, dripping with unearned authority. Evelyn straightened slowly, her back protesting after being bent over the engine. She turned to face 3 white military police officers, none of whom looked old enough to have graduated high school. Their hands rested casually near their holstered weapons, a posture Evelyn recognized all too well. "Afternoon, officers," she replied, her voice carrying the gentle lilt of South Carolina. "Just having some engine trouble. I'll be on my way as soon as I fix this connection." The tallest MP stepped forward, his name tag reading, Davidson. His eyes narrowed as he assessed her van with obvious suspicion. "This is a restricted area, ma'am. I'm going to need to see some identification." Evelyn sighed inwardly but maintained her composure. She'd been through this routine countless times before. "My ID is in my purse inside the van. Mind if I reach for it?" Davidson nodded curtly, but his companions tensed visibly as Evelyn reached through the driver's side window, retrieving her purse. She moved slowly, deliberately, knowing that sudden movements could escalate the situation. As she handed over her driver's license and retired military ID, she noticed Davidson's eyebrows rise slightly. "Colonel Evelyn Jackson," he read aloud, skepticism evident in his tone. 30 years of service." He looked from the ID to Evelyn, doubt written across his face. The second MP, a stocky young man with Connors on his uniform, leaned toward Davidson. "Could be fake," he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "We've had reports of scammers using military IDs to get on base." Evelyn felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, the same burning sensation she'd experienced throughout her military career whenever her legitimacy was questioned. "Those IDs are genuine, officers," she said evenly. "I retired as a colonel after 30 years of service. I'm just passing through to pay respects to fallen comrades." Davidson handed the IDs back with obvious reluctance. "What's your business at Fort Benning specifically, ma'am? Who exactly are you here to visit?" The third MP, younger than the others with Reynolds on his tag, had already begun circling her van, peering through windows and examining the exterior with exaggerated scrutiny. That's a lot of modifications for a civilian vehicle, Reynolds called out. Reinforced chassis, military-grade tires, extra fuel capacity. Looks like something someone would use for surveillance. Evelyn felt herself transported back through the decades, to countless similar confrontations. As a young lieutenant in 1979, being stopped at her own base gate despite wearing her uniform. As a captain in 1985, being asked to verify her credentials 3 times before being allowed into a classified briefing. As a major in 1992, watching white officers with less experience receive promotions she had earned. She took a deep breath. The van was military surplus. I purchased it legally at auction when I retired. All modifications were approved and documented. The paperwork is in the glove compartment. Davidson's radio crackled to life. He stepped away to respond, speaking in hushed tones, but Evelyn caught phrases like suspicious activity and secure area. When he returned, his demeanor had hardened. We're going to need you to step away from the vehicle, ma'am. Backup is on the way to inspect your van. Evelyn stood her ground, drawing herself up to her full height, shoulders square in the instinctive posture of a soldier. Despite her 62 years, she projected the authority that had commanded respect in war zones around the world. Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but I am a retired colonel with proper identification, temporarily stopped due to mechanical issues. I have every right to repair my vehicle and continue on my way. Davidson's face flushed red. Ma'am, I won't ask again. Step away from the vehicle now. His hand moved closer to his holster, a motion that sparked memories of other confrontations with far deadlier outcomes. Evelyn held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated, but she recognized the dangerous precipice this situation balanced upon. Slowly, deliberately, she took one step back from her van, then another. As she moved, she heard the approach of additional vehicles, tires crunching on gravel. The backup Davidson had called for had arrived, and with it, Evelyn knew, would come either escalation or intervention. The question was which would reach her first. 2 military vehicles pulled up behind the MP's patrol car, dust swirling in their wake. The doors of the lead vehicle opened to reveal a tall black man wearing the uniform of a major general, his 4 stars catching the Georgia sunlight. Behind him emerged a small entourage of aides and security personnel. Evelyn continued working on her van, deliberately ignoring the new arrivals. She had learned long ago that appearing busy often prevented unnecessary confrontation. As she leaned deeper into the engine compartment, her sleeve rolled up, revealing a portion of the faded tattoo on her forearm. Major General William Thomas approached with measured steps, his face an unreadable mask of military stoicism. At 58, Thomas carried himself with the confident authority that came from decades of service and the constant need to prove himself in a system that had never fully welcomed people who looked like him. What seems to be the problem here, officers? Thomas asked, his deep voice carrying natural command. Davidson straightened to attention. Sir, we're investigating a suspicious vehicle and individual near the secure area. The subject claims to be a retired colonel, but we have concerns about the vehicle modifications and her presence here. Thomas nodded, eyes scanning the scene until they landed on Evelyn, still focused on her engine. His gaze dropped to her exposed forearm, where the partial tattoo was visible. Something flickered across his face, recognition, followed by disbelief. Thomas had first heard the rumors as a young lieutenant fresh out of West Point in the late 80s. Whispered stories about a classified all-black special operations unit that had operated during Vietnam and the Cold War. They called themselves the Shadow Legion, a unit so covert that most of the military hierarchy denied its existence. Throughout his career, Thomas had dismissed these tales as military urban legends, the kind of stories that circulated among black service members looking for heroes who looked like them in a history that often erased their contributions. But there had been that one time, during a classified briefing about Cold War operations, when a senior officer had let slip a reference to an operation in Cambodia that matched the Shadow Legion stories. When Thomas had pressed for details, the officer had abruptly changed the subject, and the files referenced were mysteriously unavailable when Thomas tried to access them later. Thomas moved closer to Evelyn, his eyes fixed on her forearm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, "would you mind showing me your full tattoo?" Evelyn straightened slowly, sizing up Thomas with eyes that had seen more combat than most generals twice her age. After a moment of consideration, she deliberately rolled up her sleeve, revealing the full tattoo. A black panther in mid-stride, with a series of numbers and coordinates beneath it. Thomas stared at the tattoo, his composure cracking for the first time. "Shadow Legion," he whispered, almost to himself. "Operation Black Storm, Cambodia, 1972. Evelyn's eyes widened fractionally, the only indication of her surprise. "You know about Black Storm, General?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Only rumors. Files redacted. 30 hostages rescued when 3 conventional teams failed. Casualty rate over 60%. Mission Commander." He paused, eyes returning to Evelyn's face with newfound recognition. "Mission Commander was a Lieutenant Evelyn Jackson." The MPs watched this exchange with growing confusion. Davidson stepped forward. "Sir, with all due respect, we need to complete our security protocol. This vehicle needs to be searched, and we need to verify." Thomas turned to Davidson, his expression hardening. "Officer Davidson, this woman is Colonel Evelyn Jackson, former commander of one of the most decorated covert units in American military history. A unit that saved hundreds of American lives while receiving virtually no recognition because of the color of their skin." He turned back to Evelyn, drew himself up to his full height, and executed a perfect formal salute. "Colonel Jackson, it is an honor to meet you. Your operations in Southeast Asia are still studied at the highest levels of Special Forces training, even if your unit's name has been redacted from the materials." The MP stood in stunned silence as Thomas held his salute until Evelyn, after a moment's hesitation, returned it with the precision of someone for whom such gestures had once been daily ritual. Davidson cleared his throat. "Sir, we still need to follow protocol. Her vehicle is a modified military transport that she has every right to own." Thomas interrupted. "Officers, you are dismissed. I'll take full responsibility for Colonel Jackson from here." The MPs exchanged uncertain glances, but military hierarchy prevailed. With obvious reluctance, Davidson nodded to his companions, and they returned to their patrol car. As they pulled away, Davidson made a call on his personal cell phone, his eyes never leaving the rearview mirror where Evelyn and Thomas stood talking. Thomas turned back to Evelyn. "Colonel, I apologize for the reception you've received. Please allow us to assist with your vehicle repairs. Our motor pool can have you back on the road within the hour." Evelyn regarded Thomas with measured caution. "That's generous, General, but unnecessary. I've handled worse than a faulty connection." Thomas lowered his voice. "Colonel Jackson, there are people on this base who would consider it an honor to meet you. People who've only heard legends of the Shadow Legion. And there are files here, histories that should include your unit but don't. Perhaps it's time some truths came to light." Something flashed in Evelyn's eyes, a mixture of old pain and cautious hope. "The Army spent decades burying what we did, General. Why would they allow those truths to surface now?" Thomas smiled, a determined expression that reminded Evelyn of faces from her past, the few allies who had fought alongside her against not just external enemies but the entrenched racism of the military establishment. "Because I'm not asking permission, Colonel. I'm offering an invitation." He gestured toward the base. "Come as my personal guest. Let us repair your van, and perhaps we can begin to repair other things as well." As Thomas's aide arranged for Evelyn's van to be towed to the motor pool, either of them noticed the senior MP in a vehicle parked at a distance, watching intently as he spoke into his phone. "Yes, sir," Davidson said quietly. "She has the tattoo, just like you described." And General Thomas recognized it immediately. "Yes, sir." "I understand. Complete discretion." He ended the call, watching as Evelyn climbed into Thomas's vehicle. For the first time since the confrontation began, Uncertainty rather than suspicion showed on the young officer's face as he witnessed the deep respect Thomas showed to this elderly black woman whom he had nearly arrested moments before. General Thomas's staff car passed through security checkpoints with ease, the guards snapping to attention at the sight of his 4 stars. Beside him in the passenger seat, Evelyn Jackson sat with perfect military posture, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings with the hypervigilance of someone who had spent decades in hostile territory. Behind them, a military tow truck transported her van to the base motor pool. "Fort Benning has changed since I was last here," Evelyn observed, noting the modernized facilities and diverse faces among the personnel they passed. Though she also noted the quick, curious glances directed her way, an elderly black woman in civilian clothes riding alongside a 4-star general. Some of the white officers they passed barely concealed their surprise, while several older black service members seemed to do double takes, as if sensing something familiar about her presence. Thomas nodded, understanding the subtext of her observation. "Progress comes slowly in some areas, quickly in others. We have more diversity in the ranks now, but the upper echelons still don't reflect the full spectrum of those who serve." He navigated the car toward the administrative section of the base. "When I was a lieutenant, I heard stories about the Shadow Legion. Whispers among black officers about an all-black special operations unit that took on missions no one else could complete. Most dismissed it as wishful thinking, a military urban legend. But I always suspected there was truth behind those stories." Evelyn's expression remained neutral, but her eyes carried the weight of unspoken history. "Truth has always been a casualty of war, General. Especially when that truth challenges the narratives those in power prefer to maintain." Thomas guided the vehicle into a reserved parking space outside the main administration building. "Colonel Jackson, would you share how you first joined the Army? The records I've managed to access, which aren't many, suggest you enlisted during the height of the civil rights movement." Evelyn gazed out the window, momentarily lost in memories. "I joined in '68, right after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. My father had served in Korea, came home to a country that still made him drink from separate water fountains. He told me the military was changing faster than civilian society, that a black woman might find opportunities there unavailable elsewhere." A bitter smile crossed her face. He was right about the opportunities. Wrong about how hard I'd have to fight for every single one of them. Thomas led Evelyn into the building, past curious staff members who quickly returned to their duties under his stern gaze. "The Shadow Legion wasn't formed until '71, correct? After several conventional units failed high-priority extraction missions in Southeast Asia?" Evelyn nodded slightly, careful not to reveal too much despite Thomas's apparent knowledge. "History books will tell you certain operations never happened, General. Just as they'll tell you certain units never existed." They approached a large office with "Col. James Reynolds, Base Commander," etched on the door. Thomas's aide knocked and announced their presence. Inside, Colonel James Reynolds, a white man in his 50s with close-cropped gray hair and a perpetual frown, stood from behind his desk with obvious reluctance. His handshake was perfunctory as Thomas made introductions. "Colonel Reynolds, this is retired Colonel Evelyn Jackson. She served 30 years, including leadership of several classified operations during Vietnam and the Cold War." Reynolds's eyes narrowed slightly. "Colonel," he acknowledged with minimal courtesy. "What brings you to Fort Benning?" Before Evelyn could respond, Thomas interjected. "Colonel Jackson's vehicle broke down near the main gate. I've authorized our motor pool to make repairs. In the meantime, I'd like to extend every courtesy to a decorated veteran." Reynolds's gaze dropped to Evelyn's forearm, where her sleeve now covered the tattoo. "Decorated, you say? I don't recall seeing her name in any of our Vietnam recognition ceremonies." The implied challenge hung in the air. Evelyn met Reynolds's stare with the steady gaze of someone who had faced far more intimidating opponents. "My unit's operations were classified, Colonel. As were our commendations." Reynolds leaned back against his desk, arms crossed. "And which unit was that exactly?" "I've made a study of Vietnam-era operations." Thomas and Evelyn exchanged glances, an unspoken communication passing between them. Before either could respond, Reynolds continued, gesturing to a wall of photographs behind his desk. I've compiled quite a collection of Vietnam Command staff photos. Perhaps you could point yourself out, Colonel Jackson? Evelyn approached the wall slowly, scanning the rows of photographs showing mostly white officers, with an occasional black face among the lower ranks. Her attention fixed on one photograph in particular, a group of high-ranking officers surrounding a map table. In the background, partially obscured, stood a white officer whose face triggered a flash of recognition that Evelyn quickly concealed. Your collection is impressive, Colonel Reynolds, she said evenly. But as I mentioned, my unit doesn't appear in official photographs. Reynolds's smile didn't reach his eyes. Or perhaps your tattoo is merely a souvenir rather than an authentic unit insignia. Many veterans get commemorative tattoos years after service. Thomas stepped forward, his patience visibly thinning. Colonel Reynolds, I've authorized temporary VIP quarters for Colonel Jackson while her vehicle is being repaired. I'd appreciate your cooperation in making her stay comfortable. Reynolds held Thomas's gaze for a moment before nodding curtly. Of course, General. He pressed an intercom button. Lieutenant Chin, report to my office immediately. Within moments, a young Asian-American woman in her early 30s appeared, saluting sharply. Lieutenant Sarah Chin reporting as ordered, sir. Reynolds gestured toward Evelyn. Lieutenant, this is Colonel Jackson, a retired officer visiting the base. Please escort her to VIP quarters and ensure her needs are met during her stay. The emphasis he placed on escort made it clear Chen's role was as much surveillance as hospitality. Yes, sir, Chen replied, turning to Evelyn with a more genuine smile than her commanding officer had offered. It's an honor to meet you, Colonel. Please follow me. As they prepared to leave, Reynolds called out. Oh, and General Thomas? The SecDef's office called. They need you on a secure video conference in 20 minutes. Thomas frowned, checking his watch. That wasn't on my schedule. Reynolds shrugged. Apparently it's urgent. Something about budget allocations for the new training facilities. Thomas reluctantly nodded. Colonel Jackson, I'll reconnect with you as soon as this call concludes. Lieutenant Chin will see to your comfort in the meantime. As Evelyn followed Chin from the office, she caught a glimpse of a folder on Reynolds's desk, partially visible beneath other papers. On its tab was a faded insignia that matched her tattoo, the Shadow Legion's Black Panther. Outside in the hallway, Lieutenant Chin led the way with efficient steps. The VIP quarters are in the officers' section, Colonel. They're quite comfortable. Evelyn walked beside her, still processing what she had seen in Reynolds's office. Lieutenant, how long have you served under Colonel Reynolds? Chen's professional demeanor softened slightly. 3 years, ma'am. He's demanding but fair. The hesitation told Evelyn all she needed to know. And what exactly are your orders regarding me, Lieutenant? Beyond the official escort duty? Chin glanced at Evelyn with surprise, then appreciation for the direct approach. I'm to report on your movements and any discussions you have with base personnel, especially regarding your military service. Evelyn nodded, respecting the young officer's honesty. Thank you for your candor, Lieutenant. As they continued toward the VIP quarters, Evelyn couldn't help but wonder how many others on this base knew about Shadow Legion, and why a file bearing its insignia sat on the current base commander's desk, decades after the unit had supposedly been erased from military records. Have you ever encountered a situation where your accomplishments were deliberately hidden or erased? Comment number 1 if you believe what happened to Evelyn and her unit is still happening in various forms today, or number 2 if you think our society has moved beyond such discrimination. Like and subscribe to follow Evelyn's journey as we uncover more of this hidden history. What secrets will the Shadow Legion file on Reynolds's desk reveal? What happened on the mission that haunts Evelyn's memories? And who is the mysterious officer in the background of that Vietnam photo? Stay tuned as the story unfolds. The VIP quarters assigned to Evelyn were comfortable but sparse. A bedroom, small sitting area, and private bathroom in one of the older buildings on base. After Lieutenant Chen departed with a promise to return in an hour to escort her to dinner, Evelyn carefully locked the door and conducted a methodical sweep of the room, checking for surveillance devices with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades in covert operations. Satisfied the room was clean, she removed a weathered leather wallet from her pocket and extracted several faded photographs carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. She laid them on the small desk by the window, 30 black men and women in unmarked combat fatigues, standing before helicopters with blacked-out insignia. Their faces were young, but their eyes held the hardened gaze of veterans who had seen too much too soon. Evelyn traced a finger over each face, murmuring names that no official record acknowledged. She paused on the image of a tall man with Lieutenant Bars, his arm around her younger self. "Marcus," she whispered, the name carrying decades of grief. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Evelyn quickly returned the photos to her wallet before opening the door to find Lieutenant Chen holding a tray with coffee and sandwiches. "I thought you might be hungry, Colonel," Chen said, stepping inside when Evelyn gestured her in. "The mess hall can be overwhelming." The young lieutenant set the tray down and hesitated, clearly wrestling with curiosity and protocol. "May I ask you something, Colonel?" Evelyn nodded, taking a seat and indicating for Chen to do the same. "General Thomas seemed to recognize something about you, something that made him override standard security protocols. That doesn't happen often." It wasn't quite a question, but the implication was clear. Evelyn studied Chen carefully, assessing whether this was part of Reynolds's information gathering or genuine curiosity. Deciding it was the latter, she rolled up her sleeve to reveal the panther tattoo. "Have you ever heard of the Shadow Legion, Lieutenant?" Chen's eyes widened slightly. "There are rumors among some of the older black NCOs. A secret unit during Vietnam that took on missions no one else could handle. But most officers dismiss it as folklore." Evelyn sipped her coffee, the bitter military brew familiar across decades. "In 1971, 3 conventional units failed to extract American POWs from a camp near the Cambodian border. The brass determined the mission was impossible without accepting casualties they deemed politically unacceptable. But those POWs included the son of a senator and a general's nephew." She paused, eyes distant with memory. "That's when Colonel Marcus Williams proposed something radical. A unit comprised entirely of black officers and enlisted personnel with specialized skills, operating outside the conventional chain of command." Chen leaned forward entranced. "Why all black personnel?" "Plausible deniability," Evelyn replied with a bitter smile. "If we succeeded, the brass could claim credit through conventional channels. If we failed or were captured, we'd be disavowed. No official record of our existence meant no official embarrassment for the Army. And in 1971, the idea that black soldiers could accomplish what white units couldn't was considered improbable enough to maintain secrecy." Chen's expression shifted from fascination to dawning comprehension. "You were part of this unit." "I was operations officer for the Shadow Legion. We extracted 28 POWs on that first mission, losing only 2 of our own when conventional wisdom said the mission was impossible. After that, whenever the Army had an operation too risky for official acknowledgement, they called us." Evelyn's voice hardened. "We completed 37 major operations between 71 and 78. Lost 17 personnel. Saved hundreds of American and Allied lives. And when the war ended, they buried our records under the highest classification levels and scattered our survivors across different commands." Chen shook her head in disbelief. "But surely your unit received some recognition? Medals? Commendations?" "Individually, some of us received decorations for other actions," Evelyn explained. "But Shadow Legion itself was systematically erased from military records. Our medals were approved then mysteriously lost in administrative processing. Our mission reports were classified above top secret, accessible only to a handful of generals. Within a decade, we were reduced to rumors and myths." In his office across the base, Colonel Reynolds placed a secure call on a dedicated line few knew existed. "General Morrison?" "It's Reynolds. She's here at Benning." "Yes, Sir Jackson. And she has the tattoo." Thomas recognized it immediately, started talking about declassification. I understand, sir. Full containment protocol. Reynolds hung up, opened his safe, and retrieved a file marked classified, Shadow Legion, Operation Thunderbird. His expression darkened as he reviewed the contents, then picked up his phone again. Get me General Morrison's travel office. He'll need immediate transport to Fort Benning. Meanwhile, General Thomas sat in the secure communications room, but instead of the scheduled call with the Secretary of Defense, he found himself facing a blank screen. After 15 minutes of technical difficulties, he left in frustration, heading straight for the classified records section. I need access to all files related to Special Operations Units in Southeast Asia between 1970 and 1978, he told the records officer, sliding his authorization card across the desk. The young sergeant looked uncomfortable. Sir, I've just received orders that those specific files are temporarily unavailable pending a security review. Thomas's eyes narrowed. On whose authority? Colonel Reynolds, sir. Countersigned by General Harold Morrison, retired. Thomas recognized the name immediately. Morrison had been a major figure in Vietnam-era operations, now in his 80s but still wielding considerable influence within military circles. Thomas left the records office, his suspicions growing. He made his way to the base's central memorial plaza, where monuments honored units and individuals who had served with distinction. Lieutenant Chin had brought Evelyn to the same location, fulfilling her request to visit the memorial before dinner. Evelyn moved slowly among the monuments, searching methodically through the Vietnam section. Chen watched as the older woman's expression grew increasingly tense. They're not here, Evelyn finally said, her voice tight with controlled anger. 17 men and women gave their lives as part of Shadow Legion, and not one name appears on these memorials. Chen stepped closer. Colonel, what exactly happened to your unit after the war? Evelyn's gaze remained fixed on the memorial wall. We were disbanded in 78. No ceremony, no recognition. Just individual reassignment orders sending us to different corners of the military. Within 5 years, half of Shadow Legion's survivors had been pushed into early retirement, or relegated to dead-end positions. She turned to face Chen fully. We made a pact, the 30 of us. We each got the same tattoo, the panther and the coordinates of our most costly mission. We promised that someday, somehow, we'd ensure the truth was told. That our fallen would be honored. Before Chen could respond, an aide approached them. Colonel Jackson? General Thomas has requested your presence at an urgent meeting in the commander's conference room. As they followed the aide across the base, either noticed the elderly white man in civilian clothes who had just arrived at the VIP reception area, accompanied by military police. General Harold Morrison, 80 years old but still commanding in presence, signed the visitor log with a practiced flourish. Take me to Colonel Reynolds immediately, he ordered. And find out which quarters they've assigned to Evelyn Jackson. I want a security detail posted there within the hour. The commander's conference room fell silent as Evelyn entered, flanked by Lieutenant Chin and General Thomas. Around the large oak table sat Colonel Reynolds and 3 other senior officers Evelyn didn't recognize. But her attention fixed immediately on the elderly white man seated at the head of the table, General Harold Morrison. His weathered face lined with age, but his eyes still sharp with the calculating intelligence she remembered from decades earlier. Colonel Jackson, Morrison said, rising slowly to his feet. It's been a long time. Evelyn maintained her composure, though Chen noticed her posture stiffen almost imperceptibly. 47 years, General Morrison. Not since the Shadow Legion was disbanded in 78. Morrison gestured to an empty chair. Please join us. We have much to discuss. As Evelyn took her seat, Thomas positioned himself beside her, a subtle but clear indicator of alliance. Reynolds closed the door and activated the room's security protocols with a keypad by the door. This meeting is now classified top secret, he announced. Nothing discussed leaves this room without General Morrison's explicit authorization. Morrison leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. Colonel Jackson, your presence at Fort Benning raises certain security concerns. The operations you participated in remain classified at the highest levels. Evelyn met his gaze steadily. With all due respect, General, I'm a retired officer making a personal visit to memorial sites. I've breached no security protocols. Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. The tattoo on your arm represents a unit that officially never existed, Colonel. Every time you display it, you risk compromising national security. Thomas intervened. General Morrison, Colonel Jackson's tattoo is a personal memento. Without context, it's meaningless to outside observers. But context was provided. Reynolds interjected. By you, General Thomas, in front of military police officers without sufficient clearance. His tone carried a clear accusation. Morrison raised a hand to quiet Reynolds. What concerns me more is why Colonel Jackson chose to visit Fort Benning now, after all these years. Particularly when certain files related to Shadow Legion operations were scheduled for declassification review this month. The implication hung in the air that Evelyn's arrival was more than coincidence. Evelyn's expression revealed nothing, but her mind raced. She had no knowledge of any declassification review. Her annual pilgrimage had brought her near Fort Benning purely by chance, or so she had thought. Now, she wondered if subconscious awareness had drawn her here, to face the man who had authorized Shadow Legion's creation and then erased its existence. I had no knowledge of any declassification review, General Morrison, she stated firmly. My visit is personal, not professional. Morrison studied her face, searching for deception. Then perhaps you can explain why you carry photographs of Shadow Legion personnel, photographs that remain classified? Evelyn's eyes narrowed. You've searched my belongings? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Standard security protocol for VIP quarters, Colonel. Without a warrant or my consent. Evelyn countered, anger finally edging into her voice. Those photographs are my personal property, showing my friends and colleagues, many of whom died serving a country that refused to acknowledge their sacrifice. Thomas's expression darkened. Colonel Reynolds, I authorize Colonel Jackson's stay as my personal guest. Under what authority did you order a search of her quarters? Before Reynolds could respond, Morrison interjected. Under my authority, General Thomas. As the original commanding officer of Operation Thunderbird, I retained special security oversight regarding all Shadow Legion matters. The room temperature seemed to drop as Evelyn leaned forward. Operation Thunderbird. She repeated, the code name triggering visible tension around the table. November 14th, 73. Perhaps we should discuss what really happened that day, General Morrison. Morrison's facade of cordial authority cracked slightly. That operation remains classified, Colonel Jackson. Any discussion, classified to hide the truth. Evelyn interrupted, decades of contained anger finally surfacing. To hide that you abandoned 28 men and women of Shadow Legion in hostile territory after we completed our mission objective. The other officers exchanged uncomfortable glances as Morrison's face hardened. We made tactical decisions based on the intelligence available at the time. The extraction zone was compromised. The extraction zone was never established. Evelyn countered, her voice controlled but intense. Shadow Legion completed the operation, secured the intelligence assets as ordered, and reached the designated coordinates. But the extraction helicopters never arrived. We waited 36 hours in enemy territory before we realized no one was coming for us. She locked eyes with Morrison. We lost 11 personnel fighting our way out, 11 black soldiers whose names never appeared on any memorial, whose families received generic letters about training accidents, and whose bodies were buried with no military honors. Thomas looked between them, realization dawning. You deliberately abandoned them? He asked Morrison. The operation wasn't sanctioned by the Joint Chiefs. Morrison replied defensively. It was a CIA request that came through irregular channels. When complications arose, when you realized the political risk outweighed the military gain, Evelyn finished for him. So you left us to die, and when we survived against all odds, you buried the records to cover your decision. Morrison straightened in his chair. The Shadow Legion records were classified for legitimate national security reasons. The operations you conducted were beyond conventional parameters, often in countries where we officially had no military presence. And yet similar operations conducted by white special forces units received recognition. Evelyn responded. Their names appear on memorials. Their sacrifices are honored in military history. The only difference was the color of their skin. Silence fell across the conference room as the accusation hung in the air. Reynolds finally broke it, sliding a document across the table toward Evelyn. Colonel Jackson, in light of these discussions, we need you to sign this updated non-disclosure agreement. It reaffirms your commitment to maintain the classified nature of all Shadow Legion operations. Evelyn didn't touch the document. I've maintained silence for 47 years, Colonel Reynolds. I've watched my colleagues die without recognition, their contributions erased from history. I will not sign away my right to seek justice for them. Morrison's expression hardened. This isn't a request, Colonel Jackson. Until this matter is resolved, you'll remain on base under protective custody. You mean detention? Thomas interjected, anger evident in his voice. General Morrison, with all due respect, you have no active command authority to detain a retired officer without cause. Morrison turned to Thomas. General Thomas, your sympathy for Colonel Jackson is admirable but misplaced. The declassification review I mentioned involves highly sensitive operations that could impact current international relations. Her presence here, coincidental or not, represents a security risk we cannot ignore. As the confrontation in the conference room escalated, Lieutenant Chen slipped out unnoticed. She made her way quickly to the records section, using her security clearance to access the digital archives. With efficiency born of determination, she began copying files related to Vietnam-era special operations, focusing on the dates and locations Evelyn had mentioned. What she found, and what had been redacted, told a story more damning than any verbal accusation. Back in the conference room, Evelyn stood, her dignity intact despite the implied threat. General Morrison, I came to Fort Benning to honor fallen comrades, not to challenge classification protocols. But I will not be detained without due process, nor will I sign away rights I earned through 30 years of service. Thomas stood beside her. Colonel Jackson will remain as my personal guest, under my authority as base commanding general. Any objections can be taken up through official channels with the Secretary of the Army. Morrison and Reynolds exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Very well, Morrison finally said. But Colonel Jackson will remain under escort at all times while on base. And I expect this matter to be resolved within 24 hours. As they left the conference room, Thomas spoke quietly to Evelyn. They're hiding something beyond normal classification concerns. Reynolds received warning of your arrival before you even reached the gate. Evelyn nodded. Operation Thunderbird. Morrison has been burying those records for nearly 5 decades. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say in a monitored hallway, was that Thunderbird had uncovered evidence of military supplies being diverted to unauthorized operations, with millions in appropriated funds disappearing through channels that led directly to officers like Morrison. As they turned the corner, they found Lieutenant Chen waiting, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes communicating urgency. General Thomas, I've prepared the visitor briefing you requested for Colonel Jackson. It's ready in your office whenever you're available. Thomas recognized the pretext immediately. Thank you, Lieutenant. We'll review it now. As they walked away, 4 military police officers approached from the opposite direction, taking positions outside the conference room. The message was clear. Morrison wasn't simply going to let this matter drop. Whatever was in those Shadow Legion files, he was determined to keep it buried, along with the contributions of 30 black soldiers who had served their country in silence and shadow. General Thomas closed the door to his private office, engaging the security lock before turning to Lieutenant Chen. What did you find, Lieutenant? He asked, his voice low despite the room's soundproofing. Chen removed a flash drive from her pocket. Multiple files related to special operations between 71 and 78, sir. Most are heavily redacted, but there's a pattern to the redactions. She inserted the drive into Thomas's computer and pulled up a series of documents. Every operation with high success rates and minimal casualties has clear attribution to conventional units. But operations matching the dates and locations Colonel Jackson mentioned, operations with extraordinary success against impossible odds, all have unit designations and personnel rosters completely blacked out. Thomas studied the screen, his expression darkening. They took Shadow Legion's accomplishments and reassigned them to other units. Evelyn stood behind them, her eyes fixed on the documents that represented her unit's erased history. Standard procedure, she said quietly. After particularly successful operations, we'd return to base only to hear another unit being congratulated over the radio. Chin scrolled to another document, a list of medal recommendations with most names redacted but approval signatures still visible. These medals were approved at the highest levels, but there's no record of them being awarded. She pointed to a signature at the bottom of the page. General Morrison authorized these commendations personally. Thomas straightened, anger evident in his posture. This goes beyond typical classification. This is systematic erasure of black soldiers' contributions. He turned to Evelyn. Colonel Jackson, I want to hear about Operation Thunderbird. The complete story, not the redacted version. Evelyn hesitated, decades of enforced silence weighing against her desire for truth. Finally, she nodded. Thunderbird was officially a mission to extract intelligence assets from near Hanoi. That part was true. What the briefing omitted was that those assets were physical evidence of weapons and supplies being diverted from official military channels to unauthorized operations generating millions in private profit for certain high-ranking officers. Thomas and Chin exchanged shocked glances as Evelyn continued. Shadow Legion extracted the evidence as ordered. But when we reached the extraction point, no one came. No radio contact, no explanation. We were 20 miles into enemy territory with documentary evidence implicating senior American officers in what amounted to treason. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes reflected old pain. After 36 hours, Marcus, our commanding officer, made the call to move out on foot. We fought our way through 11 enemy engagements over 8 days. Lost 11 personnel before reaching friendly lines. She paused. When we finally returned, Morrison personally collected the intelligence materials. Within 48 hours, every surviving member of Shadow Legion received transfer orders to different commands across the globe. The evidence disappeared, the mission was classified beyond top secret, and anyone who asked questions found their careers suddenly stalled. Thomas's jaw tightened. And the officers implicated in the diversion scheme? All retired with full honors. Evelyn replied bitterly. Several went on to lucrative defense contractor positions. Morrison himself served on 3 corporate boards after retirement. The office fell silent as Thomas processed this information. Finally, he turned to Chin. Lieutenant, what you've done in accessing these files could be considered a security violation. I want to be clear about the potential consequences. Chen stood straighter. With respect, sir, what happened to Colonel Jackson's unit is a violation of everything I swore to uphold when I took my oath. I understand the risks. Thomas nodded, respect evident in his expression. Then we need to move quickly. Reynolds has already restricted my access to Vietnam-era files. It won't be long before Morrison finds a pretext to have Colonel Jackson removed from base or detained more formally. He turned to his computer, typing rapidly. I'm contacting General Daniels at the Pentagon. She oversees historical review for special operations. And General Washington at Central Command. We served together in Iraq, and he's been vocal about recognizing overlooked contributions of black service members. Evelyn watched Thomas work, a cautious hope beginning to replace decades of resignation. Why risk your career for this, General? These aren't your battles. Thomas paused, looking up at her. My father served in Vietnam, Colonel Jackson. Staff Sergeant William Thomas Sr. 92nd Engineering Battalion. He came home with 2 Purple Hearts and stories about miraculous rescues by soldiers no one could identify. soldiers who looked like him. His expression softened slightly. He died believing those rescuers were angels. I think they were Shadow Legion. Outside Thomas's office, Colonel Reynolds approached the security checkpoint, accompanied by 2 military police officers. General Thomas requested privacy, sir. The guard explained. His office is locked down for a classified briefing. Reynolds's expression darkened. Override authorization Reynolds Alpha 37. Security concern involving classified materials. As the guard hesitated, Reynolds' phone rang. His face paled slightly as he checked the caller ID. Hold that order, he said to the guard before stepping aside to take the call. Yes, General Morrison. No, sir, I haven't located the files Lieutenant Chen accessed. Yes, sir, I understand the urgency. As Reynolds coordinated search efforts for the copied files, Chen used Thomas's secure line to contact a journalist, her former college roommate who specialized in military affairs. I can't give details over the phone, Chen explained, but I need you to research a unit called Shadow Legion, active during Vietnam. Focus on operations between 71 and 78. Meanwhile, Thomas sent encrypted messages to black general officers across different commands, outlining the situation without compromising classified details. Within an hour, 7 generals had responded, expressing support and offering resources. For the first time in decades, momentum was building to uncover the truth about Shadow Legion. As evening fell, base security reported 3 elderly black men in civilian clothes approaching the main gate, requesting visitor passes. The first identified himself as retired Command Sergeant Major James Wilson. The second as retired Major Robert Jackson. The third as retired Colonel David Thompson. All 3 carried the same tattoo as Evelyn, a black panther with coordinates underneath. All 3 had arrived within hours of each other, despite living in different states. All 3 requested a meeting with Colonel Evelyn Jackson. When asked how they knew she was on base, Thompson simply smiled. Shadow Legion always knows where its own are located. Security reported this unusual development to Reynolds, who immediately contacted Morrison. Sir, we have 3 more Shadow Legion veterans at the gate. Requesting instructions. Morrison's voice carried controlled fury. Deny entry. Cite security protocols. And find Jackson, now? But the order came too late. Thomas had already dispatched his aide to escort the 3 veterans onto base using his command authority. For the first time in over 40 years, Shadow Legion was reuniting, not in shadows, but in the light of day. Have you ever witnessed someone standing up for what's right, even when it meant risking their own position or safety? Comment number 1 if you believe Lieutenant Chen made the right choice in helping expose the truth, or number 2 if you think military protocols should always be followed regardless of moral concerns. Like and subscribe if you want to see Shadow Legion finally receive the recognition they deserve after decades of erasure. What will happen when Evelyn reunites with her fellow veterans? Will Morrison succeed in suppressing the truth once again? And what evidence did Shadow Legion recover during Operation Thunderbird that was so damaging it justified abandoning American soldiers? The battle for justice is just beginning. The conference room in General Thomas's headquarters building fell silent as the door closed behind the last arrival. 4 Shadow Legion veterans sat together around the table. Evelyn Jackson, James Wilson, Robert Jackson, no relation to Evelyn, and David Thompson. Despite being in their 70s and 80s, each carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of elite soldiers. Lieutenant Chen stood guard outside while Thomas secured the room against surveillance. 47 years. David Thompson said quietly, his weathered hands resting on the table. 47 years since we all sat in the same room. Evelyn reached across the table to grasp his hand. I never thought I'd see this day, David. When they scattered us across different commands, I thought that was the end. James Wilson, who had served as Shadow Legion's senior non-commissioned officer, shook his head. They knew what they were doing. Separate us, isolate us, make us question our own memories until we either broke or stayed silent. Robert Jackson, former intelligence officer for the unit, looked around the table. How many of us are left? 8, including us 4. Evelyn answered. Marcus died last year, heart attack. Catherine and William are too ill to travel. Jerome lives in Alaska now, completely off-grid. She paused. The rest, we lost most after the war. Suicide claimed 5. Addiction took 3 more. The others. She didn't need to finish. They all knew how trauma and unrecognized service had hollowed out their comrades over the decades. Thomas returned, closing the door behind him. The room is secure. We have maybe 2 hours before Morrison finds a pretext to interrupt us. Wilson turned to Thomas. Why are you helping us, General? This could end your career. Thomas met his gaze directly. Because the army I serve stands for honor, integrity, and justice. What happened to Shadow Legion violates everything that uniform represents. He gestured to the documents Chin had retrieved. What I've seen in these files suggests deliberate suppression of your unit's accomplishments and sacrifices based solely on race. That's not just wrong, it's contrary to the oath I took. Thompson nodded slowly. We took that same oath. Served the same flag. Bled the same blood. But when the missions ended, we weren't the same as white soldiers. Our victories became their victories. Our dead became anonymous statistics. Evelyn leaned forward. We need to tell Thomas about the cash. The other 3 veterans tensed visibly. Evelyn. Wilson began cautiously. We need allies, James, she insisted. And General Thomas has proven himself. She turned to Thomas. When Shadow Legion was formed, we knew the military establishment might try to erase us. Marcus had us create a secure cache of evidence. Mission logs, photographs, recorded testimonials after each operation. We maintained it off the books, updating it after every mission. Robert Jackson nodded. Each of us memorized the location and access protocols. If anything happened to the unit, we swore to preserve the truth until it could be safely revealed. Thomas's eyes widened as he grasped the implication. You have independent documentation of Shadow Legion operations? Outside military control? Wilson smiled grimly. We weren't just soldiers, General. We were black soldiers in America during the Civil Rights era. We knew better than to trust the system to acknowledge our contributions. Thompson added, the cache hasn't been accessed since '79. When we added our final testimonials after disbandment. It's in a secure location requiring multiple keys held by different members. Evelyn looked around the table. I believe it's time. We're in our 70s and 80s now. If we die without revealing the truth, Shadow Legion disappears forever. The others nodded in agreement, a decision decades in the making finally reaching consensus. Thomas leaned forward. Where is this cache? Before anyone could answer, Chin knocked urgently. General, Colonel Reynolds and General Morrison are approaching with military police. Thomas moved quickly. We need time to retrieve the cache. Lieutenant Chun and I will delay them. Can you get off base without being detected? The Shadow Legion veterans exchanged knowing looks. Getting in and out of secure locations was our specialty, General. Wilson replied with a hint of professional pride. Thomas quickly outlined a plan. He would confront Morrison directly while Chin created a diversion by accidentally triggering a security alert in another section of the base. The veterans would use the confusion to slip off base in Thomas's personal vehicle, retrieve the cache, and return before Morrison could establish a lockdown. As they prepared to execute this impromptu operation, Evelyn suddenly clutched her chest, her face contorting in pain. Evelyn! Thompson moved to her side immediately as she slumped in her chair. Medical emergency! Thomas called through the door. Get a medic team here now! Within minutes, paramedics rushed Evelyn to the base hospital, creating genuine confusion that overshadowed their planned diversion. As she was wheeled into the emergency department, Evelyn grasped Thomas's arm. Southwest corner, she whispered. Old mining property. Thompson knows. Then the medical team pushed through the doors, leaving Thomas in the waiting area as Morrison and Reynolds arrived. What happened? Morrison demanded, suspicion evident in his tone. Colonel Jackson appears to have suffered a cardiac event, Thomas replied, concern for Evelyn temporarily overshadowing their conflict. The doctors are evaluating her now. Morrison's eyes narrowed. And the other 3 Shadow Legion veterans? Where are they? Thomas maintained a neutral expression. I believe they went to the chapel to pray for their colleague. Reynolds immediately dispatched MPs to verify this claim, but by the time they reached the chapel, the 3 elderly men had vanished. Thomas's personal vehicle was also missing from its parking space. Morrison's face flushed with anger. This is a security breach, General Thomas. Those men have unauthorized access to classified information. Thomas stood his ground. They're retired veterans visiting a comrade in distress, General Morrison. Unless you have evidence of specific violations, treating them as security threats borders on harassment. Reynolds returned from checking base security cameras. Sir, they left through the south gate 20 minutes ago. Guard authorized their departure based on General Thomas's standing orders from this morning. Morrison turned to Thomas. Where are they going, General? What did Jackson tell them? Thomas met his gaze steadily. I have no idea, General Morrison. But I suggest we focus on Colonel Jackson's medical condition rather than pursuing elderly veterans who've committed no crime. In the hospital room, doctors determined Evelyn had experienced a stress-induced angina attack rather than a major cardiac event. As they stabilized her condition, she gazed out the window toward the distant mountains, knowing her comrades were headed toward a cache of truth buried nearly 5 decades earlier. Meanwhile, Thompson navigated Thomas's car along back roads, following a mental map he had maintained through decades of waiting. The mining property belonged to Marcus's uncle, he explained to the others. Abandoned in the 60s but still in the family. We built a secure room behind a false wall in one of the equipment sheds. Wilson checked his watch. Morrison will figure out where we've gone eventually. How long to reach the site? 2 hours, Thompson replied. Another hour to access the cache if the mechanisms still work after all this time. Robert Jackson stared out the window. 47 years waiting for this moment. Hard to believe it's finally happening. On base, Thomas received a secure call from General Daniels at the Pentagon. I've reviewed the files you sent, Will, she said, her voice grave. This goes beyond racial discrimination. There's evidence here of deliberate falsification of records, misappropriation of honors, and potential financial fraud related to diverted supplies. Thomas lowered his voice. What about Operation Thunderbird? Daniels hesitated. Those files are still restricted, but what I've found suggests Jackson's unit recovered evidence of weapons being sold to unauthorized third parties, with proceeds flowing through offshore accounts. Several senior officers were implicated, including Morrison, Thomas finished. That's why he's so determined to keep this buried. It's not just about denying black soldiers recognition, it's about covering up potential treason. As night fell over Fort Benning, 3 elderly black veterans opened a hidden door in an abandoned mining shed 70 miles away, revealing a time capsule of truth that had waited nearly half a century to see daylight. The hidden room behind the false wall had remained untouched since 1979, preserved by careful waterproofing and climate control systems that still functioned after decades of neglect. Thompson led Wilson and Robert Jackson inside, their flashlights illuminating metal filing cabinets, sealed containers, and a small table at the center of the space. Marcus thought of everything, Wilson murmured, running his hand over the dust-free surface of a cabinet. Solar-powered ventilation, dehumidifiers, temperature regulation, all self-contained and undetectable. Thompson moved to a large safe in the corner, his fingers turning the dial with practiced precision. 3 combination locks. Each of us memorized different sequences. He completed his portion and stepped back, allowing Wilson to approach. After Wilson finished, Robert Jackson completed the final sequence. The safe door swung open silently, revealing neatly organized binders, film canisters, and recording devices from the 1970s. Every mission, Robert explained as they carefully removed the contents, mission logs with actual personnel involved, photographs documenting our operations, recorded debriefings from team members, and duplicates of all intelligence we gathered, including what we recovered during Thunderbird. They worked methodically, transferring everything into waterproof cases they had brought with them. Decades of hidden history, the true record of Shadow Legion's accomplishments and sacrifices, packed away for transportation back to Fort Benning. Should we make copies? Wilson asked, concern evident in his voice. In case Morrison intercepts us? Thompson shook his head. No time. But I made a call before we left base. Marcus's grandson is meeting us halfway. He'll take a complete duplicate set to a secure location as insurance. Robert held up a small recorder. This contains Marcus's final testimony, recorded 2 days before his death last year. He named names, dates, amounts. Everything about the weapons diversion scheme and who profited from it. The gravity of what they were undertaking settled over them. These weren't just records of military operations. They were evidence of high-level corruption that had led to American soldiers being abandoned in enemy territory. Back at Fort Benning, Evelyn had been stabilized but remained under observation in the base hospital. Thomas sat beside her bed, keeping watch not just as a concerned colleague but as protection against any attempt by Morrison to isolate her. Your friends made it out, he told her quietly. Reynolds has established checkpoints at all base entrances, but I've arranged alternate access through the training grounds. Evelyn nodded slightly. Morrison will try to discredit the evidence. Call it fabricated or manipulated. That's why we need corroboration, Thomas replied. Lieutenant Chin has been researching official records, looking for inconsistencies that support your accounts. He hesitated. There's something else. Chen's college roommate is a military affairs journalist for the Washington Post. She's already begun investigating Shadow Legion based on Chen's tip. Evelyn's eyes widened. Public exposure? After all these years of silence, it's hard to imagine. Sometimes sunlight is the only disinfectant strong enough, Thomas said. Morrison's influence can suppress internal investigations, but he can't control the media or public opinion. Morrison, meanwhile, had established a command center in Reynolds' office, coordinating efforts to locate the 3 Shadow Legion veterans and secure whatever cache they might be accessing. They've disabled the tracking on Thomas's vehicle, Reynolds reported. Last cell phone signal placed them near the state line 3 hours ago, then nothing. Morrison paced the office, his normally controlled demeanor showing cracks of genuine anxiety. They're retrieving evidence from somewhere. Evidence that should have been destroyed decades ago. A junior officer entered with a message. Sir, there's a Pentagon official requesting access to Fort Benning. General Daniels from the Historical Review Division. Morrison's expression darkened. Delay her at the gate. Security protocols. The officer hesitated. Sir, she has authorization signed by the Secretary of the Army. For the first time, Morrison looked genuinely alarmed. Things were moving beyond his ability to control, exactly as Shadow Legion had planned for nearly 50 years. In the early hours of the morning, a groundskeeper's truck approached a rarely used maintenance entrance to Fort Benning. The elderly driver presented credentials that identified him as base support staff. In the back, under a tarp, lay 3 passengers and several waterproof cases. The guard barely glanced at the vehicle before waving it through. Thompson had spent 2 years as a groundskeeper at Fort Benning after retiring from active duty. One of many Shadow Legion members who had positioned themselves strategically in civilian roles connected to military installations, maintaining their network despite official disbandment. The truck drove directly to the base hospital's service entrance, where Thomas and Chin waited. You made it, Thomas said with evident relief as the 3 veterans emerged from beneath the tarp. And you brought everything? Robert Jackson patted one of the cases. Complete documentation of 37 operations conducted by Shadow Legion, including Operation Thunderbird. They quickly transferred the cases inside through a service elevator, bringing them directly to a conference room Thomas had secured adjacent to Evelyn's hospital room. As dawn broke over Fort Benning, Evelyn, against medical advice but with determination that brooked no argument, joined her comrades in reviewing the evidence they had preserved for nearly half a century. "We need to organize this systematically," she instructed, the strategist in her taking command once more. "Mission logs chronologically. Photographic evidence correlated with official records showing discrepancies. Financial documentation from Thunderbird separated and highlighted." Thomas watched in admiration as the elderly veterans, despite physical limitations and decades removed from active service, fell into coordinated action with the precision of the elite unit they had once been. By mid-morning, they had assembled a devastating case documenting not just Shadow Legion's erased accomplishments, but the systematic discrimination that had denied them recognition, while reassigning their successes to predominantly white units. Chen arrived with news. "General Daniels has cleared security and is on her way here. And there's more, a delegation from the Association of Black Military Veterans is gathering outside the main gate, requesting entry to support Colonel Jackson." Morrison had also learned of these developments. His response was immediate and desperate, ordering the hospital sealed for a possible infectious disease case, and demanding all Shadow Legion materials be surrendered to military intelligence for security review. But his influence had begun to wane as news of the situation reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. The Secretary of the Army personally countermanded Morrison's orders, instructing base personnel to provide General Daniels with full cooperation and access. Outside the base, media vans had begun to gather as the story of Shadow Legion leaked to the press. Chen's journalist contact had published a preliminary article online, presenting the known facts about this previously unacknowledged Black Special Operations Unit and the apparent efforts to erase them from military history. By noon, what had begun as Evelyn's solitary journey to honor fallen comrades had transformed into a reckoning decades in the making. In a final, desperate move, Morrison appeared at the hospital conference room where Shadow Legion's members had assembled their evidence. "This is a mistake," he told them, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Some things remain classified for good reasons." "National security, no," Evelyn interrupted, rising to face him despite her weakened condition. "Things remain classified to protect those in power, to hide mistakes and corruption, to erase the contributions of those deemed less valuable." She gestured to the materials spread across the table. "Everything here has been declassified by time, if nothing else. The war ended 50 years ago, General Morrison. The only operations that remain sensitive are those that implicate officers like you in criminal activity." Morrison's face flushed. "You have no proof of any criminal activity. And these materials, if they exist at all, were created without authorization." Robert Jackson stepped forward, holding up a recorder. "Marcus Williams made his final testimony before he died last year. Named every officer involved in the weapons diversion scheme. Detailed every dollar that disappeared into offshore accounts. Explained exactly why Shadow Legion was abandoned during Thunderbird and erased afterward." For the first time, genuine fear showed in Morrison's eyes. "This is slander. No one will believe the claims of disgruntled veterans over decorated generals." But looking around the room, at the meticulous documentation, the Pentagon official now entering with her own investigators, the media gathering outside, Morrison finally recognized that his decades of careful suppression had ended. The truth Shadow Legion had safeguarded for nearly 50 years was about to emerge into the light, and no amount of denial could force it back into shadow. The base auditorium, typically used for change of command ceremonies and official briefings, had been hastily converted into a press conference venue. Rows of chairs filled quickly with journalists, military officials, and veterans representatives. At the front, a long table accommodated the 4 Shadow Legion members, General Thomas, Lieutenant Chin, and General Daniels from the Pentagon. Camera lights illuminated the stage as the base public affairs officer called the room to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this unscheduled briefing. General Thomas will make an opening statement, after which the principals will take questions." Thomas approached the microphone, his uniform immaculate, his expression solemn. "Today, Fort Benning hosts an unprecedented event, the public acknowledgement of a military unit whose existence has been officially denied for nearly 5 decades. Shadow Legion was an all-black special operations unit that conducted 37 critical missions during the Vietnam War and its aftermath. Their accomplishments were deliberately removed from official records, their sacrifices unrecognized, their very existence denied. He paused, allowing his words to settle across the hushed audience. The men and women of Shadow Legion served with extraordinary valor under impossible conditions. They completed missions deemed too dangerous for conventional forces. They saved hundreds of American and Allied lives. And when their missions ended, they were systematically erased from our military history because of the color of their skin. Thomas stepped aside, inviting Evelyn to the microphone. Despite her medical episode the previous day, she stood tall, her bearing unmistakably military. "My name is Colonel Evelyn Jackson, former operations officer of Shadow Legion. For 47 years, I and my colleagues have maintained silence about our unit and its missions, bound by classification orders and threats to our military careers. Today, that silence ends. Over the next hour, each Shadow Legion veteran told part of their story. James Wilson described their formation in 1971, when conventional units had failed to extract American POWs. David Thompson detailed their specialized training and the unique challenges of operating as an all-black unit during the height of racial tensions. Robert Jackson explained their unprecedented success rate and the gradual realization that their accomplishments were being attributed to other units. Throughout their testimony, photographs and documents from their preserved cache were displayed on screens throughout the auditorium, irrefutable evidence of Shadow Legion's existence and accomplishments. Reporters scribbled notes, frantically, while military officials, many learning of Shadow Legion for the first time, listened with expressions ranging from shock to shame. General Daniels then presented official documentation proving Shadow Legion's operations had been deliberately removed from military records through a systematic process that violated Army protocols. "We have identified 28 instances where Shadow Legion operations were retroactively credited to other units," she stated. "We have located medal recommendations for Shadow Legion personnel that were approved at the highest levels but never processed. And we have confirmed that 17 Shadow Legion members who died in combat were denied proper recognition, their deaths recorded as training accidents or non-combat incidents." In the back of the auditorium, Morrison sat rigid with fury, flanked by military lawyers hastily summoned from Washington. As the evidence mounted against him, his options for deniability evaporated. The testimony reached its climax when Robert Jackson played excerpts from Marcus Williams's final recording, detailing Operation Thunderbird and the weapons diversion scheme that had led to Shadow Legion's abandonment and subsequent erasure. "We recovered documentation proving weapons and supplies worth millions were being diverted from official channels," Williams's voice explained from beyond the grave. "The evidence implicated several senior officers, including then Colonel Harold Morrison, in what amounted to wartime profiteering and potential treason. When we secured this intelligence and reached our extraction point, no one came for us. We were left to die with the evidence we had gathered." A murmur rippled through the audience as Morrison abruptly stood and left the auditorium, his lawyers hurrying after him. Halfway through the press conference, an unexpected interruption occurred as an aide rushed to General Thomas, handing him a note. Thomas read it, then approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed that the President of the United States is on the line, wishing to address this gathering." The auditorium fell silent as the call was patched through the sound system. "This is the President," came the familiar voice. "I'm speaking to express my profound regret for the historical injustice done to the members of Shadow Legion. Their service and sacrifice represent the highest traditions of our armed forces, and the deliberate erasure of their contribution stands as a stain on our military history." The President continued, "I am hereby ordering an immediate review of all Shadow Legion operations for the purpose of awarding appropriate commendations and recognitions, including posthumous medals of honor for those who gave their lives. Furthermore, I am directing the Secretary of Defense to establish a permanent Shadow Legion memorial at Arlington National Cemetery and to include their operations in all future military history curricula. As the call ended, Evelyn returned to the microphone. For the first time since the press conference began, emotion cracked her professional facade. Shadow Legion was formed because black soldiers were deemed expendable for missions too dangerous for white units. We were used when needed, then discarded when convenient. This recognition comes too late for 17 of our comrades who died in service and another 15 who died in the decades since, never knowing if their sacrifices would ever be acknowledged. She looked down briefly, composing herself. This tattoo, she continued, rolling up her sleeve to reveal the Black Panther, carries coordinates where we lost half our unit, saving 200 civilians during Operation Broken Arrow. We all wear it not as a military insignia but as a promise to our fallen, that someday, somehow, their names would be known and their sacrifice honored. The press conference concluded with the announcement that Fort Benning's Memorial Plaza would be immediately updated to include Shadow Legion, with a formal dedication ceremony scheduled for the following month. As journalists swarmed forward with follow-up questions, Lieutenant Chin approached Evelyn. "Colonel Jackson, your van has been repaired and is ready whenever you wish to leave." Evelyn nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Lieutenant. After 50 years of fighting for recognition, I think it's time to complete my original mission, visiting the graves of my comrades, this time with full military honors." The following morning, Evelyn stood before her repaired van in the Fort Benning parking lot. Around her gathered her fellow Shadow Legion veterans, General Thomas, Lieutenant Chin, and dozens of active-duty soldiers who had come to pay respects to a unit they had never known existed until yesterday. As Evelyn prepared to depart, a young black lieutenant stepped forward. "Colonel Jackson," she said, saluting crisply, "I just wanted to say thank you. Your persistence in seeking recognition for Shadow Legion means everything to those of us following in your footsteps." Evelyn returned the salute with dignity. "The fight isn't over, Lieutenant. Recognition is just the beginning. The true measure will be in how the military confronts this history and ensures such erasure never happens again." As Evelyn climbed into her van and started the engine, she glanced in her rearview mirror. What had begun as a solitary journey had transformed into something far greater. Behind her van, a convoy of vehicles had formed. Her Shadow Legion comrades, other veterans, active-duty personnel, even journalists, all prepared to accompany her to the cemeteries where their fallen lay in too long unmarked graves. For the first time in 50 years, Shadow Legion would move not in shadows but in the full light of recognition, their sacrifices finally acknowledged, their place in history at last secured. As Evelyn drove through the main gate of Fort Benning, the military police, the same who had confronted her days earlier, stood at attention, rendering a formal salute to a colonel they now understood had always deserved their respect. The honor beneath her skin, the tattoo that had triggered this reckoning, had finally achieved its purpose. The shadows had emerged into the light, and history would never again deny their existence. What do you think about the story of Shadow Legion and the systemic erasure they faced? Has this story changed how you view military history and the contributions of Black Americans to our nation's defense? If you found this story moving, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who should know about these hidden heroes. Comment below with your thoughts on how we can better honor overlooked veterans in our communities today. Thank you for joining us for this powerful journey of recognition long overdue. Remember, some of the most important stories in our history are those that were deliberately hidden, and it's up to all of us to bring them into the light. The story of Shadow Legion reveals how systemic racism can erase the contributions and sacrifices of Black Americans from our collective history. These soldiers performed extraordinary feats of courage that saved hundreds of lives, yet their accomplishments were deliberately hidden because of the color of their skin. Their experience teaches us that true history often exists in the shadows of official narratives, requiring courage and persistence to bring into the light. Justice delayed is indeed justice denied, but the Shadow Legion veterans show us that it's never too late to right historical wrongs. Their 47-year struggle for recognition demonstrates the power of documentation and truth-telling in confronting discrimination. By methodically preserving evidence of their service, they created an undeniable record that eventually overcame decades of institutional denial. Their story reminds us to question whose stories are centered in our history books and whose are erased. Perhaps most importantly, Shadow Legion's journey illustrates how racial progress requires both persistent advocacy from those who've been wronged and alliance building with those in positions of power who choose to stand for justice. When we refuse to accept erasure and find allies willing to risk their own privilege to support truth, even the most entrenched systems of discrimination can eventually be dismantled. Have you ever witnessed someone's accomplishments being ignored or minimized because of their race? Or perhaps you've experienced this discrimination yourself? I'd love to hear about times when you've seen recognition finally given to those who deserved it all along. Has this story changed how you view American military history or made you wonder what other contributions by Black Americans have been erased from our textbooks? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found Shadow Legion's fight for recognition inspiring, please hit that like button and subscribe to support more stories that illuminate hidden histories. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family who appreciate powerful stories of persistence and long overdue justice. Thank you for joining us in honoring the legacy of these remarkable soldiers whose courage extended beyond the battlefield to a decades-long fight for truth. May their story remind us all that true patriotism includes confronting our nation's failures honestly while celebrating those who served faithfully despite discrimination.